Served and servant space is one of the most important architectural philosophy of the Louis Kahn. Architecture is often explained through form, structure, and function. We talk about materials, geometry, technology, and construction methods. We analyze plans, sections, and facades. But Louis Kahn approached architecture differently. Instead of asking how a building looks or how efficiently it works, he asked a much more fundamental question: how is a space organized in order to support human life? In his conversation with the students, Kahn introduced a deceptively simple idea: the distinction between served and servant spaces. At first glance, it sounds like a technical classification, a way to organize floor plans and building systems. But in reality, this idea reshaped modern architectural thinking. It redefined how architects understand rooms, circulations, structures, and mechanical systems. It challenged the modernist tendency to hide infrastructure and complex support spaces. And most importantly, it introduced a philosophical understanding of architectural order. For Kahn, architecture was not just about creating rooms. It was about understanding the relationship between the spaces where life happens and the systems that make those spaces possible. Served and servant spaces are not just functional categories. They represent a deeper logic, a harmony between human activity and architectural support. Through this concept, Kahn showed that buildings can become cleaner, calmer, and more meaningful when each space is allowed to fulfill its role honestly. In this video, we will explore Louis Kahn's idea of served and servant spaces, understand how it emerged from his conversation with students, examine how it shaped his buildings, and see why this concept continues to influence architecture today. The idea of served and servant space is one of the Louis Kahn's most influential contributions to architectural thinking, and at first it sounds surprisingly very simple. Kahn proposed that every building is composed of two types of spaces: the spaces that serve human activity and the spaces that serve those spaces. But behind this simple distinction lies a radical rethinking of how architecture is organized. Kahn believed that architecture should begin with understanding how people use space. When people gather, work, study, or live, they occupy meaningful rooms, places where life unfolds. These are the served spaces, the primary spaces for human presence, where architecture becomes life itself. Kahn expressed this idea clearly in his conversation with students, saying, "The spaces which serve and the spaces which are served. This is the beginning of architectural order." This statement revealed that served and servant spaces are not just functional categories. They are the foundation of architectural order. Architecture becomes understandable when each space is given a clear role and identity. The served spaces are the main rooms, places filled with light, activity, and meaning. They are the classrooms, laboratories, living rooms, assembly halls, and libraries where human experience unfolds. But these spaces cannot exist alone. They require support. They need circulation, structure, mechanical systems, storage, and infrastructure. These supporting spaces are what Kahn called servant spaces. Corridors, staircases, shafts, ducts, and structural cores become the servants of architecture. Kahn explains this relationship in another well-known statement: servant spaces serve the served spaces. This simple sentence contains a profound architectural philosophy. It suggests that buildings should be organized like living systems, where supporting elements enable the primary spaces to exist clearly and freely. Before Kahn, modern architecture often tried to hide these servant elements. Mechanical systems were buried in ceilings, structure was concealed beneath walls, and circulation was minimized to save space. Buildings became efficient machines, but they often lost spatial clarity and dignity. Kahn rejected this approach. He believed servant spaces shouldn't be hidden. They should be clearly expressed and given architectural presence. In his lectures, he emphasized, "I like to think of the spaces which serve and the spaces which are served as harmony." This word harmony is important. Kahn was not creating a hierarchy where servant spaces were inferior. Instead, he believed that both types of spaces must work together in balance. Servant spaces support the served spaces, and served spaces give purpose to servant spaces. Together, they create architectural order. This idea can be seen clearly in his buildings. At the Salk Institute, the laboratories are open and flexible service spaces filled with light, while mechanical towers and service areas are placed separately, allowing the main spaces to remain pure and uninterrupted. The servant space becomes visible architectural elements, not hidden technical components. Kahn believed this clarity makes architecture more honest. He often spoke about honesty in materials and structure, and this idea extends to spatial organization. A building should reveal how it works. It should show where structure is, where circulation happens, and where services are located. This creates legibility, the ability to understand architecture intuitively. Kahn once described this clarity by saying, "The served spaces are the dominant spaces." This distinction allows architecture to breathe. Served spaces can receive natural light, generous proportions, and spatial freedom. Servant spaces can handle technical complexity and structural necessity. Each does what it does best. This separation also connects to Kahn's idea of the room as the beginning of architecture. If the room is fundamental unit of architecture, then servant spaces are what allow the room to exist properly. Structure supports the room, circulation connects the room, mechanical systems sustain the room. Servant spaces become the invisible infrastructure that makes human life possible. Kahn's thinking here is deeply philosophical. He believed architecture should reflect the natural order of things. In nature, every system has supporting elements and primary elements. A tree has roots and leaves. The roots serve the leaves serve the life. In architecture, servant spaces are like roots, hidden or secondary but essential. Served spaces are like leaves, visible and expressive. Together, they create a complete organism. This organic relationship between spaces reflects Kahn's belief that architecture is not just construction, but an expression of order and meaning. He often spoke about silence and light, structure and space, order and freedom. Served and servant spaces are part of this larger philosophical framework. Served spaces represent freedom, openness, and human experience. Servant spaces represent order, structure, and support. Together, they create balance, and balance creates timeless architecture. This idea also changed how architects think about the plans. Instead of drawing continuous open spaces, architects begin to organize buildings in layers. Main rooms are defined first. Then servant spaces are arranged around them. Circulation, structure, and mechanical systems become part of the architectural composition. This creates buildings that are both functional and poetic. You can feel how they work, you can understand their logic, you can experience their order. This is why Kahn's buildings feel calm and powerful at the same time. They are not chaotic. They are not overloaded with technical complexity. They are clear and dignified. Served and servant space help create this clarity. Kahn's message is ultimately simple but profound. Architecture should reveal its structure, its systems, and a spatial hierarchy. It should allow main spaces to shine while supporting spaces quietly perform their role. When this balance is achieved, architecture becomes meaningful. It becomes understandable. It becomes timeless. And through this idea, Louis Kahn gave architects a new way of thinking, not just about rooms and buildings, but about the fundamental order of the space itself. So as a closing summary, Louis Kahn's idea of served and servant spaces may appear simple, but its impact on architecture is profound. By distinguishing between the spaces where human life unfolds and the spaces that support those activities, Kahn introduced a new way of thinking about architectural order. Served spaces become places of light, presence, and meaning, while servant spaces quietly sustain them through structure, circulation, and infrastructure. Together, they create harmony, a clear hierarchy that gives architecture dignity and legibility. This clarity is what makes Kahn's buildings feel calm and timeless. Instead of hiding structure and mechanical systems, he revealed them. Instead of complexing technical spaces, he gave them architectural identity. Instead of treating buildings as machines, he treated them as living systems organized around the human experience. And this idea remains highly relevant today. In contemporary architecture, buildings have become increasingly complex. Mechanical systems, environmental technologies, digital infrastructure, and structural requirements are far more advanced than in Kahn's time. Sustainable design, energy systems, and smart building technologies require large amounts of technical space. In this context, Kahn's concept of served and servant spaces provides a powerful framework for organizing complexity. We can see this influence in contemporary architecture, where service cores, mechanical floors, and circulation systems are clearly organized to allow flexible and open main spaces. High-performance buildings, research laboratories, museums, and large public institutions often rely on this separation between primary spaces and technical infrastructure. Even in digital and parametric architecture, the logic of separating primary spatial experience from supporting systems continues to guide design thinking. The idea helps architects maintain clarity in increasingly complicated buildings, ensuring the human experience remains at the center of design. At the same time, the concept has also faced criticism. Some architects and theorists argue that the strict separation between served and servant spaces can create rigid hierarchies. In highly flexible and adaptive environments, such as co-working spaces, open offices, or contemporary housing, the boundary between primary and supporting spaces is often blurred. Spaces today are expected to change over time, and rigid spatial hierarchies may limit flexibility. Others argue that Kahn's approach reflects a monumental and institutional mindset, more suited to large civic or cultural buildings than to everyday urban environments. In dense cities where space is limited, servant spaces are often compressed and integrated rather than expressed, making Kahn's clear separation difficult to achieve. There is also a philosophical criticism. Some contemporary thinkers suggest that architecture should embrace complexity and hybridity rather than clear hierarchical order. Instead of separating served and servant spaces, they propose that architecture should allow overlapping functions, ambiguity, and fluid spatial relationships. In this view, Kahn's concept may feel too structured or idealistic for the unpredictable nature of contemporary life. Yet even with these criticisms, the core idea remains very powerful. Kahn's concept is not simply about separating spaces, it is about understanding relationships. It reminds architects to think carefully about how buildings work, how infrastructure supports human activity, and how spatial clarity can improve experience. Whether the separation is strict or flexible, the fundamental question still applies. How do we organize spaces so that human life can unfold meaningfully? In this sense, Kahn's idea of served and servant spaces continues to resonate. It encourages the architect to design with intention to reveal the logic of the buildings and to respect the relationship between structure, technology, and the human experience. And perhaps that is why Louis Kahn thinking still feels relevant today, because in an age of increasing complexity, his message remains simple and powerful. Architecture should be clear, honest, and human-centered. When the spaces that serve and the spaces that are served work together in harmony, architecture becomes more than a building. It becomes an expression of order, life, and meaning. Thank you for watching. I hope this summary gave you a deeper understanding of the text and inspired you to explore the original book and discover its ideas in a greater depths. Architecture, art, and design and philosophy are vast field, and what we explore today is the only one step on the much longer ladder of the knowledge. There are still countless ideas, theories, and visions waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue climbing this ladder with me, please like the video, subscribe to the channel more, and share your thoughts or questions in the comments below.